Hello everyone and welcome to the longest Wednesday on record, clocking in as it stands now to record 14 days and counting. I'm Alistair, your host, and if the internet deities are with us, right now you can both see and hear me. I have no idea how long this will last or indeed what kind of quality it will be, but much like 2020, we are here for now, so let's move on. Hi, how is everyone doing? I hope you're all okay. For those of you who are new or who have begun to forget, since considering it's been so long since we were last able to do this, welcome. Some of you are here from the Magnus Archives, some of you are here from Pseudopod, some of you are here from Escape Artists, some are here from the Isle of Man, some are here from York. And we don't care where you're from. We only care that you've chosen to spend some time here with us. Thank you so much for that.
And everybody loves your shirt, so talk about the shirt.
My polo. Yeah, my Star Trek polo. Well, it was Star Trek Day yesterday, and oh my god, Grudge the Cat. Oh my god. I mean, I didn't think I could be more excited for Disco Season 3, and yet, here we are. But, yeah, I thought, get a little fancy. Yeah, been a while. Here's what we're going to do. This stream is broken up into 3 sections. I know this because the ancient texts have been passed to me from last month, where the first section is I will read you a monologue, which is kind of like the trailer. And during the trailer, you just get comfortable. Then we'll do 3 chapters of A Wizard's Guide to Defensive Baking, which, spoiler, is chapters 10, 11, and 12 today. And then we will do shenanigans. Before we go any further, however, 2 really quick things. Firstly, massive thanks as ever to Cloudy Apple Art for the Big Boy Lonely Man opening art, which is the current record holder for longest duration of opening art we've had. And get hydrated, get a drink, get some food, take any drugs that you need to take, any meds like that, and we'll kick off. Oh, and shitpost, we had a look at your stream earlier, and that was so cool. Oh my god, you are amazingly talented. That was an absolute pleasure to see. And hello to the Raiders. Right, first off, I remembered the camera, like an adult. This is normally a spot which has, or frequently a spot that's been taken up by our good friend Nate Crowley. The wit and wisdom of the magnificent Mr. Crowley will be returning next week, but this I saw and figured that you had to hear. This is from Xavier Nelson Jr., the part of the development team for. He refers to it as Dog Airport Game. I prefer to give it its full name, which is an airport intended. I believe it is an airport made for aliens, currently staffed by dogs. We begin. Okay, I just had a very interesting DM conversation. With permission from the developer, who will remain anonymous, I'm sharing it. A little context. For 2 years, I ran a column for PC Gamer magazine called Inside Development. Every month, I talk to a bunch of developers about an invisible part of game dev, and write it up to give an insight into the awful, beautiful miracle that is game development. Strangely enough, people still recognize me for doing that column. However, I also occasionally still get developers in my mentions, desperate to tell their story. They know I don't run the column anymore. Even if I was, they wouldn't want me to print what they were saying. See, I come across this a lot, or I certainly did when I ran the column. Game development is weird. It's inconsistent, it's secretive, it gets hard to hold all of it in. There are 1,000 hypocrisies and tidbits of gossip and miracles that our players will never know about, that our players can never know about. It's lonely. And so, with discretion and an eye towards the protection of all involved, we talk. The story I've been getting pieces of over the past week is wild, and in a departure, the developer associated with it wanted their tale shared publicly. I've done some light investigation to check the veracity of the story and how safe sharing it might be. From what I've found, I believe this developer. I also believe that I can share what they've told me without hurting anyone involved. So, with all disclaimers and context established, here we go. This is the story of how a cancelled Tomb Raider mobile game basically predicted 2020. As you may know from publicly available information, the Tomb Raider series has had a pretty consistent identity crisis over the past couple of decades. An approach is established and departed from. Segments of the audience get antsy. Reboots swarm the field. You get it. What you might not know is that this identity crisis is also caused by an overwhelming wave of success. You see, for as much of an icon as she is, the most popular, recognizable versions of Lara Croft today, they're on your cell phone. Check the top grossing, most downloaded apps on your mobile store of choice. You will see, I promise, at least one Tomb Raider game there. So how do you advocate for a bold reinvention of Lara Croft when a classic interpretation is making your parent company millions right now? The answer is you don't. Unless the parent company does it for you. Square Enix Corporate was aware of the growing rift between the Lara Croft of the mainstream and people's memories, and the microtransaction outfits they kept buying, and the version offered to modern players starting in the 2013 reboot. A rift that needed closing. A new game was proposed. A narrative one for smartphones, a game to bridge the gap between the most recent interpretations of Lara Croft and the version of the character most embedded in popular culture. Feelers were put out to notable mobile studios on the radar of Square Enix Corporate. Pitches were solicited. The development cycle wouldn't occur in-house, but it would be prioritized and it would be protected. They were serious about this thing. You have, I promise, heard of the vast majority of the studios contacted. However, the developer I spoke to was part of the team for the winning pitch, a fresh outfit of veterans based in Europe that has since become defunct. This game was supposed to be their big break. The pitch name was simply Tomb Texts. It was based off of principles established by the Lifeline games. A confident, compelling, and eminently human Lara Croft would enter an ancient tomb, and players would guide and assist her via dialogue choices. Sometimes, players would even be required to research real-world topics and knowledge to give Lara the information she needed to succeed. You saw how Lifeline made a bunch of money, right? Square Enix sure did. And their response to the pitch was a big old yes. So the Tomb Text pitch was accepted, and development, with the best of intentions, began. Thing is, even though the core design was apparently simple, the development process was not. It was a team of veterans. They had experience and pedigree that got them through the door with Square Enix in the first place, but they also had a creative director. And the creative director was eccentric. The creative director was spiritual. Not religious or particularly consistent, just spiritual. He approached each project as a vision quest waiting to happen, and this one was no different. As the team spun up their engine prototype for the first milestone, he vanished. 1 week became 2 weeks. 2 weeks became 4. At one terrifying point, you cannot make this shit up, the concept artist received a carrier pigeon. How do you get a carrier pigeon in the 2000s? How? The developer I spoke to was on the engineering team. Their direct responsibility was to implement story content provided by the narrative team, which at the project start consisted of the creative director. 4 weeks became 6. Finally, on the eve of the studio's first proper meeting with Square Enix Corporate after the initial signing, the creative director reappeared. Oh, I'm sorry, I said eve. I meant the morning. Like the exact morning. At the set time for their meeting, the studio creative director swept into the room, gave an exact recounting of the development process that he had not been present for, and swept back out. This mess of a man was known for logging out of Slack every time the producer logged him back in, preferring to receive printed out logs of urgent needs as opposed to relying on the ephemeral digital. No one knew how he knew what he knew. Try saying that 3 times fast. According to the developer I spoke to, it was never explained where the creative director went to, why he had gone there, or, how the hell he knew what had happened in his absence. What mattered is that he was back, and it was time to get to work. Given the disappearance, the rest of the team moved collectively to ensure that there was a second member of the narrative team this time. The hiring process for a writer began, as it so often does, mid-development. Now, I'm going off on tangents here, but to make a long story short, because I couldn't not ask, the interview process involved the signing of an NDA and a standard set of conversations with studio staff. However, Sometimes the creative director would walk in. If the creative director walked into your interview, it would be different. Without fail, this absurd, terrifying mess of a boss would walk in, look at the table, walked to the interview table, still not acknowledging the presence of any humans in the room, bend at the waist, turn his head, and lock eyes with the interviewee for 10 solid seconds. One day, the creative director walked in, did his ritual, smiled and shook hands with the writer in question. She was hired that week. To recap, at this point, Tomb Texts had a license, a lock design, a budget, a writer, a mess of a creative director, an emerging cross-platform mobile engine. But so the question becomes then, what were they making? The first major draft of the story followed Lara as she entered the titular tomb and claimed a mythical artifact with the assistance of the player. She'd accomplish her goal relatively early in the experience. Surprisingly so. By the way, if you're wondering why I'm not talking about the artifact, it's because the draft wasn't too clear. Also, it was more than a little problematic. Just a cultural appropriation slurry set forward by an extremely white dude spiraling down endlessly. Anyway, after the artifact was collected, the tomb would begin to turn against itself, initiating a quest of a different kind. One for survival. Lara would have to escape the site with her life and sanity intact, the player functioning as her only lifeline to the outside world. The point after Lara claims the artifact is where a really clever touch was introduced. Within the app's interface, a new tab slid into view, a connection to a fictional news service and media outlet, and the service began to detail a world sliding into oblivion. It became clear very quickly that the sudden string of disasters are directly related to Lara taking the artifact. Now, strangely enough, this seems increasingly significant in hindsight. Despite complaints on a corporate level, it was never planned to give Lara a method to reverse her actions. She made the decisions. She took the artifact. That was it. You can't make the world better. As Lara messages you to find a way forward in her own dire situation, you have options for how much to reveal to her about how the world is changing. You're her lifeline, remember, for better or worse. Especially given that she can't change what's happened and that she can't change what's happening. Is it cruel to tell Lara Croft what pain her actions have caused? Or is it more cruel to help her escape the tomb and let her find the world suddenly, irrevocably worse? Now, for a game intended to bridge the gap between the pain of Lara's journey in the recent trilogy and her seemingly unstoppable characterization in mainstream culture, the storyline is dark, like really dark, and we haven't even talked about the range of endings. Lara can die. Lara can go insane. Lara can become so blinded by grief that she murders the vision of a child she meets within the tomb's eldritch tunnels and is driven to kill herself. Like, holy crap, man! You can trace later rifts to these decisions. Square Enix wasn't told the full scope of the game's narrative tonalities and said, rightfully so, what in the actual fuck? Meanwhile, the creative director continued to obfuscate development and pushed harder. The role of Lara was a particular battleground. Again, Square Enix wanted a bridge. Someone with a deep sense of strength, confidence, and ability who was still human. The creative director insisted Lara represented society. In his words, Lara is not just an empathetic avatar, she is literally the representation of society, the power of society, the tangible reactions of society to a changing world, the changing world that he came back with an outline for after his mysterious journey. The outline was considered locked. No matter what, this game structure was set in stone, so make it work. At this point, the lead producer stepped in and played the same counterpoint to the creative director's increasing fervour. The creative director refused to let the writer work until a core segment of the script was complete, a template. However, a month before the first playable milestone, a system-complete run-through of a rough section of the total game, not a single word had been written. And it is at this point that the creative director, again, disappeared. Not a single line of dialogue or player choice had been checked in up to this point. However, the outline did have a detailed set of instructions for every disaster caused by Lara's hubris. They begin with a global pandemic. The creative director knew his history because he listened to a lot of podcasts at full volume in their open plan office. So the virus was called, you guessed it, SARS-2. In the actual outline of the game left behind after his first disappearance, here are the notes. Pandemic. 25% of fictional Australia consumed by fictional forest fires. Murder bees land on American shores, along with race-related police brutality riots. Kobe Bryant killed. He wrote that the race-related riots would be due to the murder of a Korean-American man by police. Not a black man, but there's other problems with his apparent fixations there that we are not going to get into. From presidential impeachment trials to an actual pandemic named SARS-2 to the release of UFO footage, this man, barring some exceptions, brought back a blueprint of 2020 nearly 4 years ago. And then he disappeared a month before first playable. Again. Left with a Bible of apocalyptic happenings and none of the assets needed for production, the team threw words and code and art at the problem for a solid month. The writer, in particular, slept in the office most nights. Finally, it was time to present the milestone. Remembering last time, the team going into the project evaluation meeting lingered at the door for as long as they politely could. They held it open. They watched an empty hallway. Nothing happened. Corporate loved what they saw. They loved the writing and they loved the evolving design and the softening of plot points that had appeared at first egregious. Crunch is never a solution, we must remember that, but the team walked out of the meeting alive and they walked out with their game and their license intact. The developer I spoke to was particularly proud of his system transitions getting noticed. Inspired by Monument Valley, the kaleidoscopic evolution of the game's backgrounds and the unexpected presentation of both art and text was years ahead of anything else out there. The creative director, by the way, is still nowhere in sight, and so the team decided to move forward with or without him. They had an approved timeline, they had a design, they had an approach from their license holder, they had an enthusiastic reaction to their first playable. They were going to be fine, they'd stay their own course. 1 week passed. 2 weeks passed. From what the developer told me, the real last straw for the entire situation was when a remote login attempted to delete their entire source control repository. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with what source control is, it's what's called the point of truth for a project, the backup for the backups. If it isn't in source control somewhere, it doesn't get saved, and it isn't in the game, or it shouldn't be in the game, at least. Someone trying to destroy source control is the equivalent of someone trying to destroy a project entire. There are fail-safes and backups, but this is a biggie. If this is gone and the backups are gone, you basically have to start all over again. Game over. So, the last straw is probably when the creative director did come back, in the middle of the night, to the office, with a can of gasoline. This only became known to the rest of the studio after the arrest, but the creative director had already been messaging the lead producer and the other business partners for 3 days. He did not reveal where he was or where he had gone. The messages were long, angry things. He claimed the rest of the team didn't understand Lara or Tomb Raider or the world he had described and that they could not release the game. Like, he was furious about the new writing, but he was particularly insistent on changing the game structure. A game structure, remember, that had been locked in stone since the beginning of the project. In those 3 days, he apparently wrote over 40 pages of script and documentation for new visions of the game, appeals to wipe the slate clean, to start afresh. There was a version of Tomb Text proposed where touching the artifact transferred Lara to space. There was a version where it insisted that she be transported to a dimension-bending bouncy house for a Flappy Bird clone. Smashing into pipes selected dialogue options. Now, in the Bouncy House version, every time the player jumped, of course Lara's breasts would also jiggle, and he insisted this would, and this is a quote, broaden the game's appeal. Needless to say, all of these game versions were rejected. The project leads believed not telling the team about the situation would protect them from lingering psychic damage, among other things. However, learning via text that your creative director has been arrested for attempted arson of your office is probably not the greatest way to start morning stand-ups either. Now, the developer I spoke to was one of the folks who found out about the creative director's messages after the arrest. The team understood why the information was kept from them, but they were also understandably perturbed that the situation occurred in the first place. It was decided that at least part of the milestone budget would be spent on security measures. Also, that each of the company's founders would keep a local backup of the game at each of their homes, in case of the worst. There were also concerns about the project's future, given, well, everything. Fortunately, or unfortunately, the arrest and continued legal machinations of a former creative director didn't kill the Toontext project. That would happen in a simple corporate strategy meeting. The viability of premium mobile games is already debated in game development circles enough. The studio just happened to catch the edge of a downturn in faith. The team had another successful milestone review after the arrest of their creative director, but as they worked towards alpha, the powers that be decided a mobile game that wasn't free to play didn't have the reach or capacity to hit the project's goals. Toontext was quietly shuttered. The studio went down not long after, and some of the folks involved left video games behind altogether. But I'm pleased to say the majority, from what I've been told, are still working in the industry, and they are thriving. For obvious reasons, the survivors of gestures at this entire fricking thing can't really list this on their resumes. Now, I had 1,000 follow-up questions and interruptions. Happy to share what additional details I've been told that I can over DM with mutuals. Get in touch. But my big one coming away from this was, what set the creative director off? If we take it for fact that he went on a drug-fueled quest that left him with a blueprint of 2020, and if we take for granted that he wanted to avoid this blueprint coming to light due to info revealed in a second quest, what would make him try to burn down the office? Surprisingly, my developer friend had an answer. The developer I was speaking to got drunk with the lead producer one night, and based on the information from that talk, he thinks we actually have a pretty good idea of what caused the creative director to finally take matters into his own remarkably flammable hands. You see, after 3 days of constant messaging, the creative director went silent. Checking logins to the source control repository after everything, the producer discovered that the director had guessed the password of a sick employee and logged in while they were away. The director apparently spent hours browsing through the game's assets and added content and stopped on a single, particular dialogue file. One of the endings shared in the studio's successful milestone review. By the way, for those asking why the director did this under an employee's account, any employee's account, it's because his login privileges were, of course, revoked. All employee passwords were also changed after the first intrusion, except for the person who was out sick. The dialogue file was an alteration of just one, of the Lara Croft Goes Insane plotlines. Its purpose was to show that some of the egregious elements of the original outline were being handled with some sensitivity and nuance in the director's absence. In the file, after the player triggers a series of somewhat hidden actions, they're actually given an option to provide Lara with direct access to the external newsfeed. She just sits in the dark, browsing through news of the carnage and sadness, and just never stops. The name of the file that set off the director? Where Lara Croft, the director's metaphor for society, endlessly engages in obsessive behavior as 2020 plays out across her screen, the thing he couldn't let come to light? The name of the file, like a horrifying number of other material connected to the creative director's outline, mirrors the real-life behavior we now struggle to fight as the world burns around us. The name is tomb scrolling.
just read a 25-minute pun.
I just read a 25-minute pun. This is why Xalavier is just an amazing human being. Just an amazing human being. The setup for that is just unbelievable. It's just so good. And also, because he does this, the follow-up thread is, "Hi, the thread I did earlier today ended in a pun, but the reality of unstable and or terrifying work conditions in games is based on real experience. My own and those of every developer I know. Keeping it quiet is the standard. I don't know a single dev who hasn't gone through something buck wild or awful. I've spent hours joking with folks in DMs about this fictional creative director or the whims of corporate wiping a project off the map, because we've all been there, and if we didn't laugh, we'd cry. So when game devs tell you about a sexist workplace or distressing co-workers, please believe them. We're so used to hiding small injustices that even the truly awful barely bubbles to the surface. Barely. The fact that you're hearing so much about the workplace conditions of game developers right now is a really good sign. It's a sign of belief. If we work and empathize and support the people who make the things we love, it says, maybe things will get better." Like I say, Xalavier is very good people.
Mother of Shaggy Dog stories.
Jax, I crave death.
A modern Ronnie Corbett? Who's Ronnie Corbett?
Ronnie Corbett is an English stand-up comedian who infamously did these 25-minute plus monologues. He was a tiny guy. He was like 5'2", sitting in a deliberately oversized chair. And there would be endless digressions, and they would always land on something similar to that.
Love a Shaggy Dog.
As a way of apology, Chungus says hi.
Chungus and his hat say hi.
Also, we had some incredible sourdough bread thanks to a recipe from Andrew, who I don't believe is in the stream tonight, and Chungus and Marguerite, you made some unbelievable bread earlier in the week.
It was really good, yeah. It turned out good. So now we have a good recipe, and he's you should hold him up again so people can see him.
Yeah, I'll switch to the big boy camera too.
There we go. He's bubbling away quite nicely. He might need a scarf to go with his hat at some point.
Happy feeding boy.
Yeah, exactly. So, and did you tell people about that other cool RQ art thing that somebody drew you?
Yeah.
What was that? I don't remember.
The RQ fan book that I think Alex unboxed today.
Yeah, there's a video of it. I DM'd it to you so I can watch it later.
And put Real Purple Almonds did portraits of the entire RQ team, and the one for me is amazing.
It's really cute.
It's got the escape pod and it's got Chungus. Chungus now has 2 pieces of fan art.
Chungus has a lot of fan art, let's be honest. And
He has
he's getting wardrobe now too.
Chungus is becoming the Diefenbaker of the stream, very clearly.
Diefenbaker?
Due South, He's a Bounty. His partner's a fast-talking Chicago cop. They fight crime and also ghosts show. It's really good, though. The Mountie...
That could be your catchphrase. It's really good, though!
No, wait, come back! The Mountie has a husky, which it's a husky, but he's playing a wolf called Diefenbaker, named after the first Prime Minister of Canada, who's deaf because he saved Fraser from a river and burst his eardrums.
Oh.
But he is such a good doggo.
Good doggo. Yeah,
Yes, please, Wendy, that would be lovely.
A little scarf and cape, oh my gosh. Oh my gosh, that would be amazing. Hang on a second, I think I've got the unboxing video link somewhere. I'm trying to remember whose Twitter account I'm logged into. Hold on! It's very confusing. But I'll put the link in the chat. Why don't you give us a little recap on where you are?
Okay, we also have What's New with Alistair this week.
Oh yes, okay. Well, it's been a week.
Well, things have happened. All manner of stuff's happened. I'm not sure what we talked about last time. I went up for 3 kind of big things in August, all of which would have been really fun, interesting writing jobs, and I got none of them. And that it has been much easier to deal with than I thought, especially as 2 of them were for companies I've previously had experience with. In one case, a company that released a project I'd co-written the week before they told me they didn't want this one. And
Pitching is hard, y'all.
Pitching's hard, dudes and friends and buddies. It really is. And I think I'm going to stop doing it for a little while. Not because I am broken or anything, but just It's not working. And I know there's the whole thing of you're going to try and push all this stuff uphill for a really long time, and then someone will slap you in the back of the head and make your milk pope. And you're like, oh, thank you. You know, all of that. And
What?
Just, I don't know. It got away from me. When I pitch for other people's stuff, it doesn't tend to go terribly well. And I think it's time to concentrate on my own stuff for a little while.
We need a history of Chungus, please.
A history of Chungus. Who is requesting a history of Chungus?
Hail to the Queen J.
Oh, hail to the Queen J. Hello. Chungus is our sourdough starter. And he was invented. He came to life.
His birthday's on there.
On here, in fact, he was born on the 20th of June. And basically, that was the point where we realised that, you know, it's time to have a sourdough starter. And the most sensible thing that we could do was give him a ridiculous name. And he looked like a Chungus. So he's called Chungus. And he has been embraced to the chat's magnificent heart. There is fan art of... Hard left turn last minute. There is fan art of him. People ship him with Bob the sourdough starter from the book that we're reading. And Wendy made him a hat. Because she was worried he'd get cold. And he's a sourdough starter. And that's...
And he's a wizard... And Bob is a wizard's familiar, so...
Bob is a wizard's familiar in the book. So it is a sourdough starter and a sourdough starter. And as Wendy says, we ship them so hard.
And he does live in the fridge, so he could get cold. That is fair. Yes, by all means, you can send us hats. Wendy has shared a pattern for how she crocheted this one earlier. We will... I'm expecting him to receive a little Santa beard for Christmas at this point.
Well, he will now.
Who knows? So, yes, we will decorate him. Hi, time to flip out. Nice to meet you.
But you looked deeply into each other's eyes and decided it was time to add to the family.
Well, you know, the ever-growing herd of microphones needed company.
He's going to be such an fancy lad. So yes, Chungus and various professional frustrations, which led to a discussion where basically I was like, I don't think I should pitch for stuff anymore. And Marguerite was like, I think that's really smart. In fact, you should say as such, and I'm going to at the top of next year. And then, of course, because the creative mind does this, I'm like, but, I mean, and because Marguerite was all like, oh, but, you know, people will come to you. And then I was like, no.
36 hours later. 36 hours later. What happens, Hauser? 36 hours later.
36 hours later. A friend of mine, who is a super talented author, DM'd me out of nowhere and went, I've got an idea for an audio drama and we should write it together. Say yes. So I was like, okay. So that's kind of where I am. On top of all of that, the Doctor Who book for Black Archive, the big critical examination of Day of the Doctor, has come back from my editor. And no one's kicked me in the nuts.
Amazing how that's not how the editorial process works.
I'm really bad at the editorial process because all of the stuff I do, I've never really received any formal training in. I've never staffed with anybody. I've always been a freelancer. I've always been Alistair, who's helping us out at the moment. And as a result of that, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to do this bit. Because being a freelancer means you're basically a prose door kicker. You know, you go in first and you write 700 words and then you get an invoice and you have to introduce yourself again in a month's time. That's not this process. This process is, here's a book, it's broken. Great, here's how you fix it. Here's a book, it's less broken. Great, here's how you fix it. Here's a book, it's less broken. That joke's escaped 3 edits, it won't escape this one. Okay, here you go. And that's the process I'm finally on. And that's the process both my brain and my heart finally realize I'm on. That I'm not invalid. I don't suck. And I honestly thought I was gonna hand this thing in and he was gonna be like, yeah, we'll pay you a kill fee, sod off. And that's not the case.
I would like you to read that line from Jax. LMAO, this dude really just said, oh, and there's that Doctor Who.
Yeah, okay. I'm aware that sounded dumb.
Oh, are we gonna play this game? Excellent.
What game?
Oh, I love this game. This is a fun game. Hold on a second.
Oh, God. Oh, you're getting the books, aren't you?
Right. So, shelf. Hold this, would you? Okay, so here's the Primeval book he wrote a part of. Here's the Star Trek book he wrote a part of. Here's the Doctor Who book he wrote all by himself.
And that, dear friends, is what receiving a loyally talking to looks like.
There you go.
There you go.
Love you.
I love you too.
Okay.
So yeah, basically, Becky, that's very cool. They're very sweet of you to say. I'm not the coolest. The coolest is very much the other person in the room. That's kind of where I am. Stuff's alright, which in this particular year is fucking shocking, frankly. I'm just mildly traumatized. But yeah, stuff's going alright. I'm working on the edits. Once those are done, I will send them in, and then it's back to my own novel. And, yeah. Let's read Ursula's book. Well, let's discuss briefly where we were the last time we read Ursula's book, which was about 8,000 years ago. If you remember, Mona had found the small, scrawny child who was absolutely convinced that his sister, who could turn invisible, could not have been murdered. Yeah, he was disappointed. Reluctantly teaming up with the kid, whose name I have forgotten to note down, but I seem to remember is Spindle. Yes. Reluctantly teaming up with Spindle, Mona then went back to the bakery, got the evidence, and yeah, things are bad. Oh, also there was the fantastic dead horse and knackering mole. Also, yes, as we move into the story, a reminder of content warnings. There will be frequent threat, persistent murder mystery, implied violence, and mild swashbuckling. I think about covers it.
Yeah, but there's nothing graphically on screen.
There's nothing graphically on screen or on page. It's worrying, but it's not scream-inducing. So,
Where are we?
Chapter 10. Everyone got water? Everyone taking any meds they need?
Oh, yes.
You got
Also,
some food?
content warnings, accents.
Content warning. Voices. Okay, we're going to have a word with Alcyon 3's dog. There's some foot attacking going on here.
I'm very sorry to hear that. Yes, this is a good time to make sure you've refilled your drink, you have a snack, stream snack.
Stream snack.
Off we go.
And off we go. Chapter 10. I didn't see Spindle for a couple of days after that. I was busy in the bakery. Not that Aunt Tabitha wouldn't let me have the time off, but I didn't want to. Baking was normal. If it was baking, then everyone else was normal too. And even if somebody was killing wizards, it was happening somewhere else, on the other side of the counter. This was maybe not as rational as it could have been, but it felt right. I was safe at the bakery. When I walked home at night, the block to the glass blower with the water gurgling from the gutters into the canal, then I wasn't safe. I hunched myself into my jacket. I felt like things were following me in the shadows. I didn't run home. Running would have let whatever was in the shadows chase me. Now that wasn't rational either. This was a slightly more grown-up version of monsters hiding under the bed, but I couldn't shake the feeling. So I stayed in the bakery as much as possible, and I hurried home at a fast walk that never quite broke into a run, and I got up very, very, very early and came into the bakery again, so that when Aunt Tabitha came downstairs, I was already wrist-deep in dough. I worried about Spindle, though, in the moments when I wasn't too busy to think. Not that there was any shortage of things to worry about. The news that spring was all bad. Lord Ethan and the army marched out not 2 days after I'd seen him. Carrick's mercenaries raiding again, I think. The customers had different ideas. Miss McGrammer just called them the enemy. Brutus the Chandler said it was Maniqua, the next province over, hiring the Carricks to attack us. The priest waited until the Chandler had left with his scones and told me that was nonsense. Nobody hired the Carricks for anything anymore, unless you were paying them to go away. Now, Karak's mercenaries are sort of like the boogeymen in our city, and actually most of the cities in the kingdom. Your mom tells you that if you misbehave, the Karaks will get you. The problem is that they're actually real, and once you grow up and hear all the stories, you realise they're a lot worse than the boogeymen. A long time ago, supposedly, they had their own homeland, and then 2 of the city-states went to war, Edom, I think, and St. Salisbury, or maybe it was Delta City, and one of the cities hired the Karaks to fight for them. When the war was over, the Karaks decided they liked it here, and they just didn't leave. Apparently their homeland is all ice and mountains and things trying to kill you, so you can see why they'd want to stick around our kingdom, which has lots of farmland and rivers and high-quality baked goods. Don't get me wrong, generally we like foreigners in our kingdom. We like anybody as long as they have money and buy scones. Some of the big port cities are crammed with people from all over the world, and they don't make them live in their own quarter the way they do magickas. The man who sells Aunt Tabitha cinnamon is from some place that nobody else can pronounce quite right, and he has tattoos all over his skin, even on the little webs in between his fingers. But the Karaks eat all the farm animals, even the horses, even the dogs, sometimes the people, and then they burn the farms for fun. They are not interested in being neighbours, they just take over towns and eat all the food and kill all the people, and then use it as a base to launch raids on other towns. Whenever that happens, the nearest cities send out the army and burn them out, and the Karaks run back to the hills for a couple of seasons and then come out, meaner, hungrier than ever before. It was probably just my imagination that the city seemed colder without the golden general in it. I felt less safe without the war wizards around. You didn't want to need them, and they had scary powers in their own right, like calling lightning and throwing fireballs, but you liked to know they were there, just in case. One thing I didn't worry about was what the army would do when they found the Karaks, because the army would win, no question. We have magic and the Karaks don't. Karaks hate magickas. If one of their kids turns up with a talent, they expose him. For the longest time, I didn't know what that meant, but it turns out they just leave him on a hillside and they let wild animals eat him. That's the sort of thing that makes you glad to live in a civilized city. The regulars all have their own opinions, but one I didn't hear was Master Elwidge's. He hadn't come into the bakery in days. I was getting a little worried about him. So I went to the farmer's market one morning, and then something happened that worried me even more.
Sorry.
There's a girl at the farmer's market who's a magicka like me. I actually think she's a lot better, honestly. She's a juggler. But when she juggles oranges, they turn blue or green or seem to catch fire. Her dad sells fruit, and every now and then she'll take out a few oranges and start juggling, and people will come over to watch. In late summer, she'll turn rutabagas into doves. Her name's Lena. She's older than me and lives outside of town, and we don't talk very much, so I was surprised when Lena saw me across the crowd and came over. She wasn't juggling oranges. Not today. "You're Mona, aren't you?" she said, "from the bakery." "Yes," I said. She nodded once, sharply, then looked around as if afraid that someone might be listening. She pulled me forward to the edge of the market against one of the brick walls. "Are you leaving?" she said. I have to buy some strawberries for my aunt." No, she shook her head. "The city. Are you leaving the city?" "Why would I leave the city?" I asked, baffled. "You know," she said, waving a hand all around us as if to take in the entire city. No? I was starting to feel like I'd come in on this conversation halfway through. "What do I know?" Lena blew air through her bangs, making them flip up. "Haven't you been hearing? The disappearances, She looked around again. "The magickas." "Well, Knackering Molly said something," I said cautiously, "but we're getting out," said Lena. "Dad and me, we're leaving tonight. There's something going on in this city. It's not healthy for magickas anymore. We're going to Dad's cousins in Edom." She looked me over appraisingly. "We're taking the Wainwright's boy, too, the one who turns rocks into cheese." You should come with us as well. What? No! I took a step back, as if she might try to kidnap me. My aunt and uncle are here, and the bakery. I took another step back. I mean, it can't be that bad. Could it? I tried to think of all the magickas I knew. There weren't many. Lena, Molly, Elwich. There was the girl who sang on the street corner and birds came down and sang with her. No, she'd been gone since last winter, hadn't she? There'd been a man with a hurdy-gurdy on that street corner for months now. Still, even if Lena was right, I was 14 years old. Leave the bakery? That's just nuts. Lena narrowed her eyes. I took another step back. She didn't have any rutabagas on her, but I wasn't sure what she could do with a strawberry. I needed those strawberries for tarts. If they turned into doves, it was going to be a real problem. I thought she might yell at me, but she shook her head and said, "Good luck then. I hope you're right." She hurried back to the fruit stand. On the way home with my strawberries, I took Peony Street, which takes you past the shop where Master Elwich, the carpenter, works. The door was closed. There were no lights in the window. It looked like an empty shop, not just a closed one. I went home as fast as I could, feeling yet again that there was something watching me in the shadows. I didn't tell Aunt Tabitha about the conversation. Probably she'd say that Lena was being ridiculous, but what if she didn't? And if she took it seriously, then I'd have to take it seriously, and that meant that I wasn't safe. Not behind the bakery counter. Not anywhere. Those were really depressing thoughts. So I threw myself into work at the bakery, but there was only so much I could do. When the pans had gone in the oven and it wasn't time for anything else to come out, when I had to wait 10 minutes before I started the icing for the cinnamon buns, when there weren't any customers, then I had a few minutes, and then the thoughts would start again. I'd steal downstairs and feed Bob, or if he'd already been fed, I'd lean my forehead against the cool stone wall and let the thoughts bubble and ferment like yeast at the bottom of my mind. Sometimes Bob would put out a mushy tentacle of dough and touch me on the shoulder. I think he knew I was worried. Occasionally he'd even drag his bucket closer to where I was sitting and brooding. It wasn't exactly thinking, if that makes any sense. I wasn't looking at the thoughts, I just knew they were there, rolling around underneath. Problem was that, like yeast, the thoughts were growing. Pretty soon, they'd overflow the edges of my skull, and I would not be able to ignore them any longer. For the moment, though, I could sort of smash them down, like dough into a pan, and think about something else. I settled for worrying about Spindle. I left day-old bakery goods out for him on the stoop a couple of times. They were gone in the morning, although it could have been dogs or raccoons or some other street kid. That was fine. Dogs and raccoons and street kids all have to eat, and the day-olds don't do anybody any good in any case. 5 or 6 days after my trip to the palace, I went down to the Rookshade Bridge with a half loaf of stale bread. Rookshade is a really good bridge for feeding the ducks, because it's low to the water and the railing has wide enough gaps that you can dangle your feet through and throw bits of bread down to the ducks. It was a nice afternoon. It wasn't raining for once. We'd had a really damp spring, and Aunt Tabitha had told me to get out of the bakery and go take a break before she hit me over the head and forced me to relax. I walked down the road by the side of the canal, avoiding the carriages and the wheeled carts selling hot buns. Nothing so good as our hot buns, by the way, with a gingerbread man sitting on my shoulder. He was the same one from the night Spindle and I had found his sister's bracelet, and he was so stale by now that you'd probably break your teeth if you tried to bite him. I didn't expect him to be walking around still, but I'd been pretty upset that night looking for Tibby. It had been a really awful day, and when I was upset, my magic worked a lot harder, or better, or something. I should probably have figured that out with Bob, the unkillable sourdough starter, but it was still a surprise. At any rate, the gingerbread man showed no signs of stopping. That was fine by me. I kept him sitting on the bedpost at night, watching the door. He was supposed to wake me up if anybody tried to get in. I don't know how well that would really work, but I did feel a little better because of it. Aunt Tabitha hadn't said anything, even when the cookie started displaying a little more initiative than was usual in baked goods. Twice he had brought me the salt without even asking, and I could tell him to put strawberry halves on top of the muffins, and he would do the entire tray. I'd been tempted occasionally to try baking a life-size gingerbread man to help out in the kitchen. Fortunately, the ovens weren't big enough for that, and I was becoming glad of it. You see, my little gingerbread familiar was fairly benign, but what if I was upset or nervous and wound up creating some kind of berserk gingerbread golem? It didn't seem likely that I could do that, but, well, best not to find out. Besides, between Lena and knackering Molly warning me, I was starting to think that it was best not to call attention to my magic. A person-sized hunk of gingerbread wasn't very subtle, and lately when I'd made cookies dance, there had been an edge to the laughter. We threw out 3 batches of old gingerbread men. Hardly anybody was willing to buy them. It's maybe not so odd that gingerbread doesn't sell in midsummer, but 1 or 2 customers left without buying anything. And then there was Miss McGrammer. "Have you seen the broadsheets yet?" she snapped when everybody else had left the shop. "The what?" I put the cookie back in the bakery case. "You'll see," she said, sniffing. She sounded maliciously pleased about something. "All you people'll see soon enough." She hadn't explained, and she hadn't come back since. Nobody missed her, but it was still strange. On the bright side, she was the only reason we baked lemon scones every day, so instead, I started making blackberry tarts, and those were much better. I trudged up the railing of the Rookshade Bridge, and I saw Spindle already sitting there, staring moodily down into the water. I caught a glimpse of him once or twice, but this time he didn't run off as soon as he saw me. The ducks had gathered under him, expecting to be fed, and the fact he wasn't throwing anything down was inciting some pretty angry quacking. I sat down next to him. The gingerbread man steadied himself by holding onto the rim of my ear. Spindle didn't say anything. Neither did I. I pulled some stale bread out of my pocket and began tossing bits down to the ducks. I handed Spindle half the loaf. He took the slices wordlessly and put them in his pockets. Well, so much for that idea. I finished tossing bits down to the ducks and dusted off my hands. "You doing okay?" I asked. He shrugged. It was a stupid question. Tibby was dead. It would never be okay that she was dead. My parents had been dead for years now, ever since the cold fever, and it still wasn't going to be okay. It would never be okay, but I guess that's just how it goes. Those are very heavy things for a 14-year-old baker to have to think. So we sat there in silence while the ducks nosed around the water for any bits they'd missed. A cart rolled by behind us with a crunch of wheels and a clop of hooves. The gingerbread man peered out from under my hair. Spindle glanced over at me, looked at the cookie, but didn't comment. "We haven't heard anything back about the investigation yet," I said finally. "Truth is, I don't even know if there is an investigation. They wanted me to be guilty, and when I wasn't, I don't know if anybody's doing anything." "Nobody ever does anything," said Spindle quietly. "Not for people like us." I wanted to say something encouraging. I wanted to promise him that the guards would find the killer. I wanted to be strong and hopeful and determined. It was hard to believe any of that when I thought about Tibby and her mismatched socks. "I'm really sorry," I said, and flicked a pebble into the dark water of the canal. A duck grabbed for it, saw that it wasn't edible, and let out a very loud quack of annoyance. "She had to cut her hair real short one winter," said Spindle. He wasn't looking at me, and I was afraid to say anything, for fear that he'd stop. She couldn't sneak if there was too much light. Lamplighter came round the corner with a lantern just when she was coming out the second-story window, and there was a constable on the corner, and he got a look at her. They went looking for a girl with real long hair, so she had to cut it. I lifted like a dozen hats for her, and she wore them, but she was never happy till she grew it back out again." He wiped his nose on the collar of his shirt. "I told her to be careful," he said, watching the ducks squabble in the water below. "I told her. We've been hearing about the magicers, you know how they're turning up dead. Somebody got Willy Thumbs last week, and he wasn't half the magic as she was. She said she'd be careful, but it didn't matter." He didn't say anything else. I couldn't think of anything to say. I didn't know any of these people, and yet, after hearing Lena talk about leaving the city, after a while I got up and dusted myself off. "If you need anything," I said. Spindle looked at me with dark eyes. His face was pale and smudged, like an unwashed ghost. "Be careful," he said. Chapter 11. 4 in the morning again. I woke up to the water clock chiming and pulled the blankets up to my chin. A minute or two later, the big bells tolled the hour, a distant sound that you might not hear if you weren't awake and listening for it. I got up. The gingerbread man sitting sentry on my bedpost gave me a small salute as I stood up. I bundled myself into my clothes, let him climb to his usual perch on my shoulder, and let myself out of the building. The streets were quiet. They often weren't quiet at midnight, but they were quiet now. Everyone walking at this hour had somewhere to be, and they were walking rapidly, with their heads down, their breath frosting in the air. The same way I walked, except most of them didn't have an animate cookie riding on their coat. I got to the bakery, and I unlocked the door. The day-olds were gone from the step again. I started up the ovens, and was crouched down, reaching under the counter to get the dough that had been left to rise overnight, when the door opened behind me. The noise was so unexpected that I jumped and banged my head on the underside of the table. I staggered back a step, rubbing the top of my skull, and I suspect that saved my life, because the knife that had been about to go into my ribs whooshed through the air instead. I stared at the blade stupidly, and then the hand holding it, which was coming out of a pale yellow-green sleeve, and my eyes travelled up the sleeve to the shoulder and the face, and I looked into the eyes of the spring green man. His eyes were almost the same colour as his clothes, an unnaturally light green, the pupils dilated in a pale, seamed face. There was a weird smell coming off him too, something heavy and spicy, like incense, and made it hard to breathe, and harder to think. Excuse me?" I said, stupidly, as if I'd caught him manhandling the baguettes or trying to open the bakery case, not trying to stab me. Trying to stab me probably deserved something other than "excuse me," but my brain really didn't seem to be working. My body, however, just fine. My body realized I was standing in the kitchen with a murderer, and before I'd quite worked out what I was supposed to do next, my body took over, spun me around, and sent me at high speed down the stairs into the basement. It was dark. I hadn't taken a light. It was black as pitch, and even though I walked through this room at least 3 times a day, suddenly I couldn't remember where anything was. I tripped over a pile of baking pans and I knocked them down with a clatter. The spring green man laughed at me from the top of the stairs. His voice wasn't deep. It was thin and sharp, like his knife. "Do you think you can hide from me in the dark?" That was exactly what I was thinking, although I didn't seem to be doing it well. I tried to disentangle myself from the baking pans and I kicked one instead. The clang seemed to go up my entire spine. My mind seemed to be working again, but it wasn't doing much except gibbering. "Oh God, oh God, oh God, oh God, he's got a knife, oh God." "I can smell you," said the spring green man, taking a step down the stairs. The boards creaked. "I can smell your magic, little bread wizard." I got away from the traitorous baking pans and scurried deeper into the basement, hands held out in front of me to feel my way. "I would have gotten you eventually," said the voice from the stairs. Another step, another creak. "I'll get you all eventually. But that little thief brat ran in here, and I couldn't drag her back out without a guard seeing, and that moved you up the list, so to speak." A list? There was a list? How many people were on the list? I found the edge of the big drying rack where we keep the onions and garlic and felt my way around the end. The scent of garlic helped clear the weirdly heavy smell of incense out of my lungs. Unfortunately, being more clear-headed only meant that I was more clear on being in a basement with a murderer standing in the only doorway. You should feel privileged. You aren't nearly powerful enough to warrant being eliminated so soon. Another step down. Creak. How many steps were there? Gods and saints, I spent most of my life going up and down those stairs. How did I not know how many stairs there were? If that idiot Oberon had taken care of you like he was supposed to, I probably wouldn't be bothering with you at all. You're almost nothing. Creak. Creak. But no, he makes a mess and I have to clean it up. Creak. Oberon. Inquisitor Oberon. I sure hadn't liked him, but what did he have to do with the Spring Green Man? Creak. I had an idea. It wasn't a good idea, and it was probably going to get me killed, but the only other idea I had was to wait until he was fully in the cellar and try to sneak past him, and that really wasn't much better. I slid along the wall, hopefully... I'm sorry, I bet he looks like a 5-year-old tried to draw Ben Shapiro from memory. That is the best. Okay, we're back. I slid along the wall, hopefully far enough, and crouched down. I felt around me, hoping I'd been right, hoping I'd got far enough back. There. Creak. You can't hide, little bread wizard. I don't need light to find you. Then he giggled. I'm going to be honest with you, I wet myself a little when he giggled. That was a sound that signaled not just a murderer like some of the thugs in the rat's nest, but someone who enjoyed killing people. That giggle went straight into the pit of my stomach and played the xylophone on my ribcage. It was completely dark, but there were bright slashes behind my eyes, and my heart wasn't so much pounding as drumming like a woodpecker on a drain pipe. I think I came close to fainting, and if I had, there wouldn't be much more to read than this, but I didn't. Instead, I wet myself, which was getting off lightly. I wasn't even embarrassed. If there's a killer coming after you with a knife, embarrassment doesn't register. There wasn't another creak. Instead, I heard the scuffing of footsteps over stone. He was at the bottom of the stairs. He was moving into the cellar. I put one hand over my mouth because my own breathing sounded incredibly loud, and I hunched myself into the smallest ball I could. I had one weapon and only one chance to use it. The gingerbread man gripped the edge of my ear and shifted slightly on my shoulder. You're over there, in the corner, crooned the spring green man, walking slowly towards me. I can smell it. Little fool. How did you manage to outwit Oberon? Please, I thought, a desperate and incoherent prayer. For some reason, the only person I could think of to pray to was the statue on the front of the church I had passed walking home from the palace, Our Lady of Sorrowful Angels. I didn't want to be an angel, sorrowful or otherwise. Please, please. The footsteps were right on top of me. I held my breath and I clenched my fingers. Got you! Crowed the spring green man as he took a last step forward, and I flung the bucket with Bob the sourdough starter over him. The man screamed. It was shock at first, and then it was pain, because Bob was mad. I'd pumped as much of my panic and terror into the dough as I could. Attack is not a command I've ever given to Bread before, but if those rats last winter were any indication, Bob knew what to do. The spring green man screamed again, and I heard flailing and a crash as he staggered into something. There were globs of sourdough on my clothes. I didn't wait around to see what had happened. I took off for the steps, somehow avoiding the baking pans, and shot up the stairs like a rabbit. Mona, this way, hissed a voice from the door. Spindle! Come on, he beckoned furiously. The spring green man is after you. He came in here. I know! I raced to the door, and I think he might be working with Oberon. We have to get on top of... Do you want him to kill her too? It was like being slapped. I sucked in a lungful of frosty air so hard it hurt. But, come on, there's no time. He turned and ran. I wavered for a second, no more heard the basement stairs creaking, and took off after him. We pounded through the streets, skidding on the frost-lit cobbles. I kept my eyes fixed on the back of Spindle's jacket. I didn't dare look around. If I looked around, I might lose him. Spindle took a route as twisty as a baked pretzel, but more importantly, I might look behind me and see the face of my pursuer. It was probably stupid on me, in a morning full of stupidities, but I kept worrying about whether Bob had survived. On the run for my life and fretting over a sourdough starter, it could only happen to me. I realised that a lot of people wouldn't even consider Bob to be alive as such, but I'd grown attached to him. We ran for at least 3 blocks and I couldn't keep it up. Slow down. Wait. Please. There was a stitch in my side, so painful I wondered if I hadn't been stabbed after all. Spindle twisted his head around, looking annoyed. What, already? Please! He slowed to a fast walk, and I gasped, killed. I shook my head, clutching at my side. Did it matter if we ran? The Spring Green Man had said he could smell my magic. Did that mean he could track me like some kind of evil bloodhound? I managed to glance around this time, before we plunged into yet another alleyway. We were off Rat's Elbow and going in deeper. I didn't even protest. While somebody in there might decide to kill me, somebody out here had already tried. It was scary in the rat's nest, though. The buildings weren't just run down, they were falling apart. Some of them were burned out, and some of them had collapsed completely. Even the ones that were just piles of rubble showed signs of life, though. There was a clothesline running from a hole in a pile of rock to a pillar. Somebody was actually living in the rubble. There was a dead dog in the middle of the street. It was only barely light enough to see it, and I might have missed it, but Spindle detoured around it. It had been a big dog. It was too much. In the morning, it had already been too much. I threw up. After a couple of seconds, I felt somebody pull my hair back. When I looked up, shaky and sweating, it was Spindle. Thanks, I mumbled, wiping at my mouth. He shrugged. I felt a little better. Not much. I felt cold, mostly. I hadn't grabbed my jacket on the way out of the bakery, and the wet patch on my pants was freezing. People weren't staring at me here the way they had in the Rat's Elbow. There weren't many people out, but there was a little cluster at the mouth of every alley, and when I looked up, there were people crouched on the edges of the buildings too. They were watching the street. Not just us, though we were the biggest and most obvious things on the street at the moment, particularly given the vomiting, but they were watching everything. They were guards. No, not guards. They were sentries. They were people who were watching to see who and what was coming into the rat's nest, and if they saw anything, they were going to alert more people. Given where we were, I did not want to know what those other people would look like or what kind of weapons they might be carrying. Where are we going? I asked, trying to keep up with Spindle. He had slowed to a brisk walk. Away. Nobody comes near who don't belong here. I didn't belong in here, but it didn't seem like the right time to say so. Fortunately, somebody else said it for me. Mona! Spindle! What are you doing in here? The voice was familiar, as was the clunk, clunk, clunk on the stones. I looked up gratefully into the dead face of Nag and the bird's nest tangle of nagging Molly. This is no place for you, girl, or you either, Spindle, even if you think you're tough. Spindle jerked his head, rolled his eyes. I put a hand on Nag's shoulder and tried to think of something to say, and I couldn't come up with anything for a minute. Molly tilted her head down and looked at me. Go, you all right? Somebody just tried to kill me, I whispered, feeling tears squeeze out of the sides of my eyes. A single, painful sob escaped, and I stuffed the side of my hand into my mouth, because the rat's nest did not seem like a good place to cry at all. Molly's mad eyes softened. She rooted around in the nest on Nag's back and dropped a blanket across my shoulders. It was old and tattered, and it didn't smell very good, but neither did I. And it was warm, which was the important thing. Come on, she said. Grab it on the Nag's tail. Let's get you someplace a little safer. You can tell Molly all about it. She nudged Nag forwards, the skeletal tail twitching in front of me, bones wrapped in old ribbons with bits of stiff hawk's hair sticking out around the edges. Not the most appealing handhold, but I grabbed on. It felt like holding a bag full of twigs. The gingerbread man climbed right up Nag's tail and sat on one of the horse's hip bones. He kicked his heels as if to say, "Giddy up!" Spindle muttered something under his breath, but he followed behind us anyway. We let the dead horse lead us into the twists and turns and alleys of the rat's nest. Significant water. Knackering Molly listened to my whole story, and she didn't ask any chapter 12, sorry. Knackering Molly listened to my whole story, and she didn't ask any embarrassing questions like why I thought attacking somebody with a sourdough starter would work, or why I started crying when I talked about Bob. What if he was dead? I mean, really dead this time. Oh God, what if he died saving me? I mean, you may think it's strange crying over a bucket of yeasty sludge. I know Spindle probably thought I was crazy, but it wasn't just any sludge, it was Bob. He made amazing bread, and he liked me, insomuch as sludge likes anybody. Molly understood, though. When you spend most of your time with a dead horse, you learn to respect other people's weird pets. By the time I'd gotten to the end of the story, my nose was dripping. Molly drug a handkerchief out of her pocket and handed it to me. It was dry. Bits of it were unpleasantly crunchy, but I couldn't afford to be picky. "Thanks," I mumbled, blowing my nose. "Sorry." "It's all right, go. You've had a shock and no mistake." Spindle snorted. He was leaning in a corner with his hands shoved into his pockets and a sour expression. I could tell he thought I was being a baby, and that made me pretty mad. I bet nobody had tried to stab him today. I wiped my eyes and sniffed furiously. We were at Knackering Molly's home, or at least one of her homes. She called it a squat, which sounded vaguely rude. It was half a house on the edge of the rat's nest that had fallen over, so one side looked almost normal, and the other side was a crazy quilt of collapsed beams. There were old crates and ragged bits of rug on the floor, and she'd hung burlap sacks over the windows to block them out. It probably wasn't very structurally sound, but since there was a whole horse skeleton stomping around the room, and the rest of the ceiling hadn't fallen in yet, I decided not to worry about it. I had much bigger things to worry about anyway, like what to do next, and how not to be murdered. Okay. I took a deep breath and scrubbed up my face. I didn't want to cry anymore. Crying wouldn't help. What do we do now? We should find the constables or somebody, right? Spindle made a rude sound. "Fat lot of help they'll be. Wouldn't be surprised if they sent him after you." "Oh, come on." I rolled my eyes. "You're telling me you think the constables are conspiring to set assassins on bakers?" That Inquisitor Oberon was a bad apple was obvious. The Spring Green Man had said as much, but thinking that people like Constable Alphonse and Constable Montgomery were in league with Inquisitors and assassins was ridiculous. They were people. They ate pastries. Alphonse's sister lived on the next street over and came in every market day to buy a scone. They didn't even make signs to ward off bad luck when they thought I wasn't looking. "Somebody did it," said Spindle, stubbornly dropping his chin onto his chest and glaring at me. "Guards never care about people like us, as long as we don't make trouble. They're trying to wipe magic us out now, so you don't make trouble. Started with Tibby, and now they're going for you." I appealed to Knackering Molly. "Molly, this is nuts. You don't think the constables are behind this, do you?" "Not the constables, no," said Molly slowly. "They're following orders is all. But somebody's giving those orders. I was hearing rumours about the Spring Green Man on the street before you ever turned up in the Rat's Elbow, girl. I need to ask some questions, maybe call in a few favours." She stood up. "You kids stay here a while. Not sure how long I'll be gone." But you're leaving?" She swung herself up on Nag, who clomped across the creaky floorboards and out the door. Spindle hurried to yank the burlap curtain aside. "Got questions to ask, Baker girl," she shot over her shoulder, and was gone. The clunk, clunk, clunk of Nag's hooves faded into the darkness. It was almost morning, and I could just see the edge of light over the top of the houses, but it hadn't gone down to street level yet. She left. Just like that. I mean, sure, she was a little nuts. Okay. She rode a dead horse. She was a lot nuts, but she was a grown-up, and it seemed like she knew what she was doing. I certainly trusted her judgment a lot more than I trusted Spindle's. And if you were a grown-up, you didn't just leave two kids alone in a house with a madman on the prowl trying to kill them, did you? Apparently Molly did. I probably would have stood in the doorway with my mouth hanging open for 5 minutes, but Spindle dropped the sacking back down and I had to step back. I couldn't help it. I started sniffling again. It wasn't real crying, I wasn't sobbing or anything, but there were some tears, and my chest ached the way it does when you know that a good hard sob is just waiting to get out. I wouldn't let it out, not with Spindle standing there looking at me like it was pathetic. I didn't see what he had to be so smug about anyway. He'd cried after we found Tibby's bracelet, and I hadn't been mean to him about it or anything. He let out an annoyed sigh and flopped down in the corner of the room. I know this struck me as horribly unfair. Sure, he saved my life, and now he was stuck in this shack with me instead of out doing whatever he did. But what did he have to be annoyed about? Nobody was trying to kill him. Sorry this is bothering you, I snapped. I wouldn't have gotten attacked if I'd known it would have been so inconvenient. He flushed and mumbled something. I sat down because there wasn't anything else to do, and we sat in the room in an irritable, crackling silence. I wondered how long it would take Knackering Molly to find out what she wanted to know, or whether the Spring Green Man would find us first. It was definitely getting light out. The edges of the burlap sacking over the windows went from black to grey to a kind of watery tan. Aunt Tabitha would be getting up soon, and she'd wonder where I was. And the bakery was a mess, and Bob was scattered all over the cellar. She'd probably be worried sick. She might not even be able to make cinnamon rolls and sticky buns and gingerbread cookies and set the bread, and oh, my stomach was growling. You wouldn't think that you could be hungry after someone tried to kill you. You'd be wrong. I still got that bread you gave me yesterday, said Spindle. It was probably a peace offering, but I wasn't in the mood to accept it, and anyway I'd have to magic it a lot softer before I could gnaw through bread that stale. I just didn't have the energy right now. No thanks. It's all I got, said Spindle. Unless you want to eat that cookie riding round on your shoulder, it's all we're gonna get. No! I put a hand over the gingerbread man protectively. Nobody eats him. And anyway, he's really stale. The cookie tweaked my ear indignantly at that. Might change your mind soon, said Spindle, smirking. You don't get to be so picky when you're on the lam. The cookie made a rude gesture at him. My stomach growled again for emphasis. I am not on the lam, I said. My chest felt hot and tight, as if the tears had got squeezed until they cracked open. I was angry. Nearly as angry as I had been at Inquisitor Oberon. I felt like I might split open, right down the middle of my sternum. I haven't done anything wrong. Having somebody try to kill you doesn't make you a criminal. Spindle snorted. Sure. Take that to the constable, see how far you get. It was the last straw. You know what? Maybe I will. I scrambled to my feet. The gingerbread man shifted hastily to hang on. What? Mona, no. I will go to the constables. You're just paranoid and think because you're a street rat, everybody's like you. Which wasn't fair, and I felt guilty immediately. But the angry squeezing in my chest wouldn't let me stop. I stomped to the burlap curtain and wrenched it aside. Spindle balled his hands into fists. Knackering Molly told us to stay here, and then she left us alone with no food and no explanation or anything. I did feel a little guilty about leaving, but mostly I just felt mad. Why shouldn't I go to the constables? I'd never committed a crime in my life, not unless you count filching cookies from the case, and I'd baked those cookies in the first place. That didn't really count. It was no wonder people like Spindle and Knackering Molly were paranoid, but I was a respectable citizen. The constables were there to protect me. I stalked into the street. Mona, don't be stupid. Spindle tried to get in front of me, but I shouldered past him. You're going to be in big trouble. Content warning, Karen.
Mona is having a Karen.
I demand to speak to your manager. We were on the edge of the rat's nest. I should have been scared, but the anger was still doing all the talking. If I'd been thinking clearly, I would probably have tried to find the safest way out, but instead I just picked the direction I thought was right and ploughed forwards, ignoring the scampering of sentries and the puzzled faces watching me. Mona! The alleyway took a couple of zigzag turns. As if I'd had the sense to be scared, I wouldn't have made at least 2 of those, which were prime ambush spots, and probably only the fact that I so clearly had nothing worth stealing kept me from getting mugged right there, then spilled out onto Varley Street. I stomped onto the sidewalk. Spindle halted at the mouth of the alley and made a grab for the back of my jacket, but missed. Varley is a broad avenue running along the canal. It's usually full of street musicians because the sidewalks are wider than usual, but it was still so early that hardly anybody was about yet. I could hear someone tuning their fiddle a little way away. A few cautious notes, then a halt, and a few more random notes, then another halt, splattering like drops of rain against the stones. But I wasn't looking for a street musician. I was looking for a constable. And there was one, leaning against a lamppost across the street, about half a block up the road. I broke into a run. "Here now, what's the trouble?" asked the constable, startled as I raced up to him. "You have to help me!" I was panting. He wasn't one of the men who patrol our neighbourhood, but he was wearing the uniform, and he had a broad, kind face. "Please! Of course I will, love," he said promptly. "What's wrong?" "Somebody tried to kill me." I waved my hands. "It was the spring green man. He was wearing green. I was in the bakery, and he had a knife. Tried to kill you." His eyebrows rose sharply. "Spring green, mercy me." He put an arm around my shoulders. "Here now, it's all right, love. I'm sure there's been some sort of misunderstanding. Just come with me and we'll get this all sorted out." I felt the knot in my stomach loosen. This was exactly what I wanted. Some responsible grown-up to get it all sorted out, so I could go back to my normal life and make cinnamon rolls. "It'll be fine now, Mona," said the constable. "Never you worry." He turned, still with the arm around my shoulders, so I had to turn with him. He cupped his free hand to his mouth. "Hello!" he called. Up and down the road, a few more blocks over, another constable answered. "Hello!" How had he known my name? He was holding me awfully tightly, and I squirmed a bit, but his grip didn't loosen, and I suddenly felt very, very cold. Because I was pretty sure that I hadn't told him my name at all. I squirmed harder and tried to pull away, and he grabbed my wrist in one hand. It wasn't too painful. I really don't think he was trying to hurt me, but he wasn't letting go either. "Hold still, love," he said, trying to sound stern and reassuring all at once. "We've got orders to bring you in if you turn up. Somebody wants to talk to you, that's all." "Let go! I haven't done anything wrong." "Then you've got nothing to be afraid of," said the constable. "Stop that, girl. I'm not going to hurt you." "Then let go!" I kicked him in the shins. He grunted. "Now don't be like..." He never finished saying what I wasn't supposed to be like, as 2 things happened simultaneously. Spindle slammed into the back of the constable's knees, and the gingerbread man launched himself off my shoulder and went for his eyes. He fell down with a wild yelp, batting the enraged cookie aside. Spindle rolled out from under the man's legs and scrambled to his feet. I snatched my tiny gingerbread protector from the cobbles. The fall had knocked one of his icing buttons loose, but he was otherwise unharmed, and turned to run. There was another constable hurrying towards us from down the street. He'd gotten close enough to see that something was happening. I turned the other way, and Spindle grabbed my elbow and yelled, "This way!" We raced up Varley Street and across a footbridge. We had barely reached the far end when I heard footsteps pounding on it. I looked back. There were 3 guards chasing us now. "Oh God, you were right," I moaned as we ducked into an alley and ran down it, jumping over old boxes and broken crates. Rats scampered out of our way, chittering angrily. "Spindle, you were right." Pardon me. "Told you so," he panted. "Probably all got orders last night." There was a constable at the end of the alley. He said, "Here now," but Spindle went right and I went left, and he missed both of us. I flung myself through a gap in a courtyard fence that was too narrow for a grown-up. It was almost too narrow for me, and Spindle was right behind me while the constable growled and rattled at the gate. "Over the back wall," said Spindle. "Hurry!" Punching dough for hours a day gives you pretty strong arms, but it still wasn't easy to get over the wall. Spindle had to actually get under me and shove my legs upwards. It would have been embarrassing, but when you're running for your life, you tend not to worry about these things. "I see you, Anil. I see you." The road we came out on was clear, but I could hear "hello" and "they went this way" echoing down the streets. They were between us and the rat's nest. I could tell Spindle wasn't sure where to go next, and my heart was hammering against my ribcage until I thought it might explode. We skidded through an intersection, past the fiddle player whose instrument let out a very unmusical squawk as we tore past her. "I see them! There!" If only there had been more people about, we might have lost ourselves in the crowd. If it had been darker, we might have been able to hide. If I wasn't a stubborn, hard-headed idiot, we wouldn't be in this mess in the first place. Another bridge loomed out of the early morning gloom. "Down!" hissed Spindle and wrenched me sideways. There was a water stair there, a set of steps cut into the concrete leading down into the canal. The water stairs lead to tunnels where the sewer workers can get into the trains, presumably to clear out rats and zombie crayfish, and to make sure the sewers aren't going to collapse under us. I know Spindle was thinking that maybe we could get into the trains and lose the constables that way, and it was a good plan. It was a really clever plan, except for the enormous locked grate under the bridge. Spindle rattled the bars futilely. The padlock had a latch as thick around as my thumb. There was no way we were breaking through it. "Can you pick that?" "Sure, if I've got time." "Hello!" sounded directly over our heads. "They're on the bridge," I whispered. "They'll be down here in a minute," Spindle whispered. "Can you swim?" "Oh." You don't swim in the canals. Not unless you're a duck, and even the ducks probably don't enjoy it much. Whenever it rains, the sewers overflow directly into the canal. At high summer, the city stinks in ways that even poets can't describe, and that's not even including the stuff that people dump in there as a matter of course. We get our waters from wells, not from the canals. You jump in the canal if you're trying to kill yourself, not if you want to go for a swim. "No," I said. "Can you?" "Not really." "Did you see 'em?" asked a constable at the far end of the bridge. "They didn't come by me." "Can you magic us out then?" asked Spindle, rolling his eyes wildly at the sound of the voices. "Bread! I work with bread! Only bread!" Spindle slapped his pockets and came up with the half loaf I'd given him yesterday. "All right, now what?" He looked so expectant I didn't know whether to cry or hit him. "Now nothing! I can't do anything. I mean, maybe if you could get them to eat it." I had a sudden absurd image of Spindle throwing bits of bread to the constables, and the men quacking like ducks as they fought for the floating scraps. I could feel hysterical laughter welling up in my throat and crushed it. I will have plenty of time to go mad with terror after they've caught me. And then that stupid image of the constables in the water and the scraps of floating bread caught me, and I didn't feel the urge to laugh anymore. Floating bread. Floating bread. "Give me the bread," I said. "Check the water stair," called one of the constables. "They might have gone to ground. Half a loaf, not sliced." Well, that was easy enough. I held the stale bread in both hands and suggested that maybe it was tired of being in one piece. It resisted for only a moment, then fell apart in exactly even slices. It took me a week last autumn to learn how to make bread slice itself. I made a lot of ragged stumps at first, and it's a good thing Aunt Tabitha believed in me, because we had to put about 50 mangled loaves on the discount pile and make a whole lot more into bread pudding before I got the hang of it. I still tend to leave pretty thick end pieces, but I'm a lot faster than using a knife. I made 5 good-sized slices, and we probably only need 4, so nobody would be stuck with the heel, and they were stale already, and as I held them, I told them to get even staler, to get so hard that they were practically stone. This bread wouldn't dissolve in water. This bread hated water. Water was the enemy. "Float," I ordered the bread. "No matter how heavy you get, float." There was a clatter as one of the constables started down the water stair. "Here," I told Spindle, handing him 2 of the slices. "I don't know how we'll stay on them, but it's the best we've got." The constable peered into the gloom and cried, "Hey, you there, come on!" I set the bread into the murky green water, took a deep breath, and stepped out onto it. 1 foot on each slice. We were much too heavy, of course. It's impossible to float on bread, which is why magic had to get involved. "Hold us up," I ordered the bread. "Don't sink." If you have ever tried to stay afloat on a pair of magic bread slices, then you know what it was like. Otherwise, all I can say is that I do not recommend it. The slices were from one of our big sourdough rounds, so they were a pretty good size, but my feet still stuck out a little over the crust. Staying balanced was nearly impossible. It was like trying to walk on moving ice. One foot went one way, the other foot went the other way, and I nearly went down into the sludge. Then I overcompensated and nearly went down the other way as my left foot shot out from under me. Spindle caught on quicker than I did. He had both slices in the water and a foot on each slice before I'd managed to get my balance back. The constable stared at me. He could probably have reached out and grabbed me, but honestly he was too flabbergasted. His mouth hung open, and his eyebrows were so high they'd vanished under his hair. You'd think he'd never seen anybody ride bread before. The gingerbread man put his hands to either side of his head and made faces at the constable, as best you can when you do not have a tongue to stick out. There is a river somewhere that flows into the city, breaking into all the canals, and that river flows eventually into the sea. This means that there is a vague current. It carried us away, not too swiftly, while Spindle and I flailed and rocked and tried not to fall in, and the constable stared after us as if we'd grown wings. But it worked. That was the thought that kept going through my mind. It's working, sweet lady of sorrowful angels, it's working! The bread was stale enough. My magic was strong enough. We floated on the surface of the water, and even though it splashed over the sides occasionally and soaked our shoes, the bread continued to float. Look out! The current was pushing Spindle into me. I tried to get out of the way, but bread isn't very good at evasive maneuvers. At the last second, I leaned one way and he leaned the other, and we passed with an inch or two to spare. It didn't get any easier to ride, but we did get a little better at it. The best way was to crouch down with your knees close together so that you didn't slide too far to either side and risk having your feet go out from under you. There were pilings in the water that were harder to navigate around, but you could grab onto them to steady yourself, so they were actually more help than harm. I think the bread caught on to what we were doing and tried to steady us too. I'm not saying bread is intelligent, mind you, but magic is. At one point, an eddy caught one of my slices, and it was either turn around with it or fall off completely. So I turned. A line of constables was just visible on the bridge, all staring after us with identical expressions of stunned dismay. One broke away and started running down the road, trying to keep pace with us, but the road turned, and we floated between a row of houses that came right up to the canal's edge. The gingerbread man on my shoulder waved to our pursuer as we drifted out of sight. "We're getting away," Spindle cried. "We're actually really getting away. On bread." "We are," I said, "but we should find some place to get off soon. I don't know how long I can keep magicking this bread from getting soggy. I don't want them to get any bright ideas about nets." Spindle nodded. "Or crossbows," he added grimly. Crossbows? They wouldn't shoot us, would they? I mean, we hadn't... "Somebody wants to talk to you," the constable had said. What if that somebody was Inquisitor Oberon? What if nothing? Who else could it be? There was a grate ahead where the canal ran under street level. The grates were wide enough for two kids to pass through, although I had a bad moment when each of my slices went on a different side of a bar, and I had to grab the bar and swing awkwardly around it to keep from falling over. The ceiling on the other side was low and filled with moss. I could hear dripping sounds from all directions. Spindle and I crouched over our bread and let the canal carry us down the tunnel of dark water. And that's chapter 12.
All bread hates cops.
All bread hates cops.
And Annel has been on rare form.
I
captured several of them.
I also saw all the various. So riding bread, huh?
Yeah.
All bread hates cops. Yes, indeed. Right then.
Poor Mona. Poor Spindle.
Yeah, but the corner's turning now. I really genuinely love the very kind of pacifist and at the same time, no, I'm special. I can magic bread. Let's do bread stuff. Thing that she has going on. That's really cool. I love that. You know what else I love? Shenanigans. La 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 shenanigans.
You just have to sing a little song, don't you?
I do. I really do.
So what do we have this week?
This week we have Distraction by Silvercolor. This is on AO3. We will put the link in the show notes, of course.
Escape on pain of death.
So this is Distraction, written by Silvercolor, and the summary is John is not having a good day. Fortunately, the Admiral is there to fix it. Yeah, Silver, this is yours. Notes, written for TMA Comfort Week on Tumblr for Tuesday's prompt, Distracting from Injuries. I'll add all my fills for this week to the collection, so have a look for the others as well if you like. It had been several days since Jude's visit. John's hand continued to burn, as though it was still held in that molten lava grip. It ate at him, tore through his head like a migraine, clawed at his focus. Focus. He had to focus. This mess wouldn't solve itself, after all. He was suspected of committing a murder he certainly did not commit. Someone, multiple someones even, knew where he lived, and it was only a matter of time before more of them came to find him, and his hand was melting ablaze, the pain devouring him like... No. Focus. Take things one step at a time. Think it through. There must be a solution. Next step would be finding more information. More information was always the next step. He knew where to find Michael Crew now, and at this point all he had to do was wait for Georgie to relax a bit. Georgie had found him after Jude's visit, passed out on the ground, apparently curled on his side around the Admiral. She had been worried and angry, but not about the fact that a complete stranger had been in her house. The problem was that John had been injured, and in her own words, needed to learn to look after yourself, John. Please, you can't go on like this. She wasn't wrong, of course. That's why he was still here, on her couch, under a kind of house arrest, and trying to figure out what to do next. Georgie wouldn't like it, that he was still planning. But what choice did he have? Someone was sending him statements. Jude, and who else knew where he was staying, and his hand wouldn't stop screaming pain down his nerves. Focus. Deep breaths. If he could just focus for long enough, John felt certain he could figure out what to do, and when he had a plan, then perhaps he could bonk. The Admiral had other ideas, apparently. Having approached him from behind the couch, the Admiral had taken one big leap up the back of the couch. There, he had headbutted John in the side of the head, and then proceeded to climb down his chest and turn circles in his lap. "Oh, okay. Hello, Admiral. Are you..." John said softly, about to ask if the Admiral was going to continue stomping circles on his legs or actually going to lie down. The Admiral responded with a look that said, "I shall lie down when I wish to, cohabiting human, and not a moment sooner." He spun several more circles before finally deciding to lie down more against John's chest instead of on his lap. Now, stuck with a cat on his chest and sniffling at his nose, John let his head fall back against the couch. "You're right, Admiral." He lifted his uninjured hand to carefully, respectfully stroke the Admiral's fur. "You're right. We've seen too much adventure recently, haven't we?" The Admiral stretched up to headbutt his chin. "We both deserve to take a break." The Admiral closed his eyes and purred. Later that afternoon, Georgie found them there, still lying on the couch, both fast asleep. There you go. That's
really
lovely, Silver.
sweet. Very, very sweet. People are happy that you get to do John voice that's not...
It's like, no, fuck you. Statement begins.
I love that sticker so much. Oh, that was really sweet. I don't think we have any other shenanigans tonight.
I don't think we do. But we have done close to 2 hours.
And it hasn't fallen over! Yay! Victory! And we had lots of horrible punny suggestions for the whiteboard for next week.
Magnificent. I do hope you've harvested them all.
Yes, I kept them. Did you show every... I don't remember if it was still on the board last time, but that was this week's. All right.
Right. Thank you so much for joining us, everybody. This has been unusually fun. This is always fun, but it's really, really good to be back. Oh my god. You can catch up with us again on Sunday between 10 and 12 BST, British Standard Time. And we will be continuing on Windbound, which is a survival game, which we've been playing for a couple of weeks on Sundays.
And you should tell people how you did some...
Yeah, I did a little experimentation after the stream stopped last Sunday. And let's just say that the discovery of the ability to make leather has drastically increased the survivability of the game and is very bad news for the nearest Gorehorn. We will be making weapons on Sunday and having burgers. Yes, it will be stab in the butt hours one more time.
Thank you for putting the link in, Silver. Let folks know about show notes.
Yes, there will be a full link to everything in here on the show notes, which will be a Twitter thread, which I will build basically as soon as I'm done talking to you. And yeah, then, like I say, we'll be on 10 till 12 Sunday. And if the internet gods continue to be with us, and it sure looks like they might be, we'll see you back here next Wednesday at 10. Have a good one, everybody.